Passage 4. This passage is about liberalism. Normally, passages which are on isms from humanities, sociology, even history to some extent, are slightly difficult. This passage, when you read, so how do you judge whether a passage is easy or difficult? Quickly read through the passage in less than a minute, about 30-40 seconds. When you read the passage in less than 30-40 seconds, you can determine that, oh God, this is a hard passage, this is a tough passage. Now, my advice to students is don't just skip the passage because it's hard. If it's the first, because you say I'll do it later, and when you've solved 15 questions or 20 questions, you will not be in the best frame of mind to answer it. At the same time, if you're starting with a passage which is tough and you don't do well, that is another headache. So you take a call. What you do is quickly read through the passage, process whatever you can, and then see the questions. You can answer at least 2 out of 4 if you are aspiring to get 99 plus percentile. Otherwise, you'll say, I'll do this later, and take it from me, 99% of the cases, you'll not have time to go back. Because it's such a tough passage, who's going to read? Last 5-7 minutes of the test, you anyway can't do anything. So at that time, do the questions where there is no minus marking, like the parajumbles or odd one out parajumbles, right? So if you're reading this passage and you find it tough, quickly skim through it, read, don't skip anything. Let's do that. And then I'm not going to do the summary of this passage the way I summarize other passages. I'm only going to summarize those aspects of the passage which are easy to simplify. The ones which are tough, we're not going to look into it. And then we'll see how we can answer 2 out of 4 questions at least correctly and accurately. And that serves our purpose, all right, without spending too much time on it. Liberalism, according to Fukuyama, is primarily a system to manage diversity. Its foundation idea is tolerance, for which reason Fukuyama places its root in the 17th century at the end of the early modern European wars of religion. The first part, he says, liberation is based on tolerance. He swiftly moves on to so basically we can understand this has been written about, the excerpt is a critique or an analysis of a book on liberalism or an article on liberalism by Fukuyama. He swiftly moves on to individualism, property rights, free trade, leaving the reader to fill in the gaps on what all this has to do with each other. The historical introduction proceeds at such a pace that there's little time for details. From the French Revolution onward, Fukuyama identifies 2 competitors to liberalism, nationalism and communism. So he talks about liberalism, he talks about history. If the reader also doesn't understand how this happens, then comes the main part. He identifies 2 competitors to liberalism, nationalism and communism. Social democratic practices are introduced in the same breath with communism but are clearly compatible with liberalism. That means, what is compatible with liberalism? Social democratic parties are aligned with liberalism. They can coexist with liberalism. That's my first paragraph done. Fukuyama's thesis from here will be that liberalism has a core idea, its emphasis on individual autonomy. The core idea of liberalism is emphasis on individual autonomy that works best in moderation but has been taken to the extremes that have in turn led to illiberal backlash. Liberalism's core idea is individual autonomy, which should be practiced in moderation. Unfortunately, liberals take it to the extreme, which is why there is a reaction to it. That's what I understood. Done. First, Fukuyama looks at economic thought, where neoliberalism and neolibertarianism took trust in individual economic freedoms to lengths that proved destabilizing. Gives the example first, economic thought. Economic thought gave economic freedom, but the economic freedom was so much that it led to destabilizing. Fukuyama believes that liberal critics of excessive state intervention are onto something. Well, they have a point. What is the point? Government support can incentivize dependent behavior. So those who criticize excessive state intervention in an individual, they have a point. When the state gives too much help and aid to the individual, the individual becomes dependent on the state. But that moderation is the key. Here also, the key is moderation. Fukuyama looks favorably upon Scandinavian countries which tax their citizens and provide public goods. So he supports Scandinavian countries who follow a policy of taxing the citizens, also providing welfare measures. This is compatible with liberalism properly understood. This is, he says, what liberalism properly understood means. But it does not take away personal responsibility. It does not take away personal responsibility because you are giving tax. So it balances personal responsibility and freedom. That's what Fukuyama believes. Underlying destructive neoliberal policies was an anthropology that linked human well-being only to consumption. So what next he comes to a term, destructive liberal policies believed they lay focus on only consumption rather than production as well. So that was the problem. That was what he calls a destructive neoliberal policy that relied on spontaneous order rather than coordinated action. Didn't believe in coordinated action of a lot. It believed in spontaneous action of individuals. Again, Fukuyama is sympathetic to theories about efficient market and self-organization, but this theory also can be carried to the extreme. So I'm okay with efficient markets and self-organization, but shouldn't be carried to the extreme. So if you remember, the key word here is no extremes, that is wrong, moderation, that is right. That's what Fukuyama seems to be telling throughout. Also, liberal economic theory rooted in individual has a difficult time accounting for intangible social goods such as respect, pride and solidarity. So, liberal theory cannot really explain all these terms. They're not mistakes so much as blind spots. Individualism, though the result of a contingent history, is here to stay. Individualism is here to stay. But neoliberalism carried it to the extreme. It's good to think of individualism, but don't carry it to the extreme. So far for the neoliberal over-interpretation of individual autonomy. So the neoliberals over-interpreted the concept of individual autonomy or individualism. On the left, liberal thinking overshoots itself in the form of hyper-abstract notion of the self. It gives this hyper-abstract, it's not just abstract, it's overly abstract notion of the self. So its idea, its concept or notion of the self is very abstract. That is the substrate of this autonomy. Substrate, sub means something that lies below. So you're talking of individual autonomy, but liberals have this very abstract notion of the self which forms the basis of this concept of autonomy. In John Rawls, the dominant theoretician of contemporary liberal ideas about justice, the persons whose choice are the basis of social contract have been stripped of all their contingent qualities. Fukuyama agrees with critics who accuse Rawls of relinquishing any substantive notion of good life in favor of unconstrained choice. What can you make from this? So there is this John Rawls, who's a contemporary liberal. Fukuyama agrees with John Rawls's critics. What does he say? He says John Rawls has focused too much on unconstrained choice. Individuals should have limitless choice without any restrictions. And he says in pursuing this concept, he has totally ignored the notion of good life. So if you just have choice and choice and choice, it doesn't necessarily result in good life. That balance is not there. Rawls focuses too much on unrestrained, unrestricted choice and ignores the notion of good life. Are we not supposed to value a public, spirited, studious, hardworking person more than a good-for-nothing, weed-spewing social media addict? So basically he says one side you have work, you have a good life which comes from certain principles. On the other side, it's my choice to do what I want. So Fukuyama gives the question, would you not prefer a hardworking person rather than somebody who just does this? But Rawls' theory, he gasps, would not allow us to judge these two people differently. Got it? So basically Rawls ignores the idea of good life, and he focuses too much on unrestricted choice of an individual to live life as he wants. The last paragraph of the passage is the toughest. Read it. If you don't understand it, just go ahead. If there's a question on this, we'll come back to this. Even apart from the suspicious reliance on the subjunctive, it seems to me that we have entered the realm of philosophical fiction here. Subjunctive means hypothesis. So he says, forget hypothesis, we've gone into another region, the region of philosophical fiction. Suppose these conclusions can be somehow shown to follow from Rawls's setup, the veil of ignorance apparently preventing those in original position from recognizing with Fukuyama that this is the only thing that you need to know. The complete absence of deserved praise or blame is unsustainable. You cannot have a society where there is a complete absence of praise or blame. Cannot have it. There is no serious case that such ideas have been translated to a significant extent into political views or policy choices in liberal societies. Okay, these have not been sustainable, these have not been applicable. That's what we interpret. Question 13. According to Fukuyama, the major weakness or weaknesses of liberal economic theory is or are what? Since we have not gone A and B, B and C options, we assume it is a single. It can lead to unrestrained individual economic freedom, which can prove harmful. It can lead to people becoming dependent on government support. It gives respect, pride, and solidarity to only a few of its citizens. It is dependent on interrelated activity rather than on impulsive organization. Okay. Generally, for these answers, they give synonyms of what has been used in the passage. Interrelated activity is nothing but coordinated action. And impulsive organization is nothing but spontaneous order. Is that the first one? What is a weakness? Liberal economic theory and the extreme one, the weakness is what Fukuyama was pointing. He said they supported spontaneous order rather than coordinated action. So this is the opposite of what has been mentioned. So D is out. Where does he mention respect, pride, solidarity? He says liberals have not been able to explain these concepts. Correct? But he does not say anything about only few of them, it gave it only to a few people, a selected few, and not to the others. So it's again out of scope of the passage. So we are left with options A and B. It can lead to people becoming dependent on government support. Which one? He agrees with the critics of excessive governmental intervention. But is that a weakness of the liberal economic theory? Excessive government intervention can lead to people becoming dependent on government support. If you have, he gives the example of Scandinavia and all, where it has to be balanced. Correct? So the statement by itself is not a weakness of liberal economic theory. One is yes. Giving individuals too much economic freedom can be destabilizing. He said that, therefore A is the correct answer. If you remember the bit we did about destabilizing.